Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to a new episode of our Letter to Voxes podcast. Today, we are journeying back to the 1830s, right into the heart of classical economics. We're going to be dissecting a work that's famous, not so much for proposing new facts, but for enforcing a kind of stunning intellectual precision. I'm talking about Nassau W. Sr.'s detailed outline of the science of political economy.
It's so easy to forget how chaotic the language of economics was back then in the early 19th century. You had these giants, Ricardo, Malthus, building these enormous conceptual structures, but the materials they were using were fundamentally vague, often inconsistent.
And that's where Nassau W. Sr. comes in. He's a legal mind, first and foremost, who then turns to economics, and he sees this definitional anarchy as the single greatest threat to the science itself.
Absolutely. So our mission today in this deep dive is to trace his attempt to settle these foundational disputes, really, once and for all. We're going to see how he surgically narrows the scope of what economics even is.
And how he redefines these essential terms: wealth, value, production, and of course the one he's most famous for, introducing a completely new concept into the economic lexicon: abstinence.
It's true. If you're looking for a shortcut to understanding the building blocks of modern economic thought, why profit exists, why scarcity, not labor, drives value, how capital is truly formed, this is it. This outline is your essential reading list, just distilled.
And it offers, I think, a surprising amount of clarity on concepts we are still arguing about today, like the difference between necessary spending and, well, wasteful consumption.
Let's get into it.
Okay, so let's begin by grounding ourselves in the life of the man who demanded all this rigor, Nassau W. Sr. He was born in 1790 in Compton, Berkshire, and was a highly educated English lawyer and economist who lived until 1864.
And his education was absolutely elite. We're talking Eton College, then Magdalen College, Oxford. Crucially, he was a private pupil of a man named Richard Whately, who later became the Archbishop of Dublin.
Why is that connection so important?
Because that intellectual background, steeped in law and in logic, gave him this really unique perspective on economics. He started to see it as a science whose conclusions could be derived almost mathematically, from just a few initial self-evident premises, like geometry.
So he becomes this hugely influential figure, but mostly behind the scenes. I read that he wasn't known for his great public speaking, which was a bit of a drawback for an advocate in court.
Right, but he was an unparalleled analyst, a counselor to the government, and that analytical expertise, that's what led to his academic breakthrough. He was the very first person to hold the prestigious Drummond Professorship of Political Economy at Oxford, starting in 1825.
And they clearly valued him, because they brought him back for a second term later in life.
They did, and his public service really cemented his role as an architect of what would become the Victorian social state. He served on the Poor Law Inquiry Commission of 1832, which led to these radical, very controversial changes in how poverty was managed.
And also the Royal Commission on Handloom Weeders in 1837. So these commissions, they really placed him squarely at the intersection of, pure economic theory and just brutal social reality.
And that's where the paradox emerges, because here you have this deeply engaged man, a man who corresponded with major political thinkers like Alexis de Tocqueville and was actively shaping policy. And yet he insists on really, really narrowing down the scope of his own science.
That's the core intellectual move of the outline, isn't it? Defining political economy not as the science of happiness or government, but solely as the science of wealth.
Yes. Historically, early writers like Stuart or Sismondi, they had these massive briefs. Stuart wanted the science to, I think the quote is, guarantee a certain fund of subsistence for all inhabitants and provide everything necessary for their wants. So that included advising on social organization, maximizing general welfare, everything.
And Senior just cuts right through that. His definition is laser-focused. Political economy treats solely the nature, the production, and the distribution of wealth. That's it. Everything else, the moral implications, the social applications, whether it leads to misery or prosperity, that belongs to the broader art of government.
And this distinction is so crucial for you, the listener, to grasp. Senior is trying to create a pure science. The economist's job, in his view, is not to recommend or to dissuade. They just state general principles that are true according to the evidence, regardless of how much sympathy they might feel for the poor or disgust for the profligate rich.
So if an economist concludes that, say, raising a tariff will protect one industry, but it will starve 10,000 others, their job ends right there. The statesman, the politician, they take that conclusion and then weigh it against political stability, moral obligation, military necessity, what have you.
Exactly. Political economy, for Senior, is a subservient science. It provides facts, it provides inevitable outcomes, but it does not dictate policy. If the economist fails to maintain that impartiality, the whole thing just collapses back into political advocacy.
Okay, but this objective stance, it has to depend entirely on a stable foundation. Senior argues that the premises of political economy consist of, and I'm quoting here, a very few general propositions based on observation or consciousness, things that are almost universally admitted once you state them.
Which means the main difficulty of the science isn't gathering facts. It's the consistent and accurate use of terms, the language.
And this is a direct shot at his predecessor.
Oh, absolutely. He criticizes eminent writers, particularly Mr. Ricardo, for confusing nomenclature. Ricardo, for example, would sometimes substitute the term value for cost, which just makes his logical arguments unnecessarily opaque.
Even simple adjectives were used inconsistently. Senior points out that high and low, when applied to wages, sometimes meant the actual amount of money you received.
The popular sense, right.
And then sometimes it meant the proportion of the total product going to labor, which is the technical sense.
And that kind of ambiguity, using the same word to mean two different things in a single argument, is fatal in a science that's aiming for mathematical precision. Senior felt he had to strip the existing language of its baggage and redefine every term from the ground up. That methodological rigor is maybe his greatest gift to the field.
So, if political economy is the science of wealth, then the first thing you have to do is define wealth, precisely. Nassau W. Senior states that wealth includes all those things and only those things which have value, which means they can be purchased or hired. And value, in turn, requires three distinct, indispensable constituents.
The first one is utility, and Senior defines this incredibly broadly. It's the power, direct or indirect, of producing pleasure or preventing pain.
This is a really crucial clarification because in common English usage at the time, utility often just meant something that served as a means to an end, a tool.
Right. And if you only define utility as means, then you exclude things that are ends in themselves, like a great painting or a delicious meal, from being wealth, even though people will pay a fortune for them. Senior avoids that error. He just equates utility with being an object of desire. Simple as that.
The second constituent is limitation and supply. If something is infinitely abundant, like the air in an open field, it has utility but no value. It has to be scarce.
Seems simple, but it's so fundamental. It means that while the concept of value is subjective, it's derived from our desire, our utility for it, the condition for exchange value is objective, it's limited.
And the third and final quality is transferableness, or appropriation. The power to provide that pleasure or prevent that pain has to be transferable, either forever or just for a period. This is what allows for exchange.
This is an important point because it lets Senior include certain personal skills, what we might call mental capital, as wealth, as long as they can be appropriated for a time. Think of an eminent lawyer. He transfers the use of his intellectual ability to a client during a trial. The client buys that benefit.
So the lawyer's skill is wealth because it can be exchanged.
Exactly. The only thing that can't be transferred is the immediate personal pleasure the lawyer feels in exercising that dexterity. That's not part of the exchange.
Okay, so this definition of value, based on utility, scarcity, and transferability, this becomes the launch pad for his most famous critique, the one against his contemporaries who were championing the labor theory of value.
Right. Economists like Malthus, Torrens, McCulloch, they all restricted wealth to things that required human exertion to procure or to preserve. Senior just says, no, labor is not essential to value, only limitation of supply is.
So why was the inclusion of labor such a dominant idea at the time?
Oh, think about it. In a society that was rapidly industrializing, dominated by manufacturing, labor was the most common source of limitation. If something took immense labor, its supply was naturally limited and therefore it was valuable. They mistook the effect for the cause.
The effect being scarcity caused by costly labor.
When the real cause was just scarcity itself, which can arise from any source. He uses these great thought experiments. If a man just carelessly finds a valuable pearl on the seashore or discovers some incredibly rare mineral without any effort, does that pearl lack value because no labor was expended?
Of course not. Its value is inherent because its supply is limited.
That's his point.
Right.
Senior says labor only constitutes value because the supply of labor itself is limited. If that labor produces a pearl, the pearl is valuable. But if nature produces an even rarer object with zero labor, that object is equally or even more valuable. If gold aerolites were to rain down from the sky, they'd be immensely valuable based purely on their rarity and desirability, not on the non-existent labor that went into making them.
He's essentially establishing the foundation for understanding natural resource value and passive wealth. You don't need to put in sweat equity to generate value. You just need to control something scarce that people want.
Exactly. And this reframing is critical for the distinction he's going to make later about rent. It removes the moral judgment, this idea that value has to be earned through exertion, and places it purely in the realm of market dynamics. Desire meets limitation.
So if we circle back from wealth to its primary attribute, value is the quality that fits a thing to be given and received in exchange. Which brings us to demand and supply.
Senior defines demand as indicating the force of causes that give utility or desirability to a commodity, and he's very careful to warn against confusing demand with just, consumption or the desire plus the power to buy something,
Why? What's the problem there?
because that confuses the cause of value with its effect or its expression. Demand is the underlying desirability.
And supply, then, is the weakness of the obstacles that limit a commodity's quantity. So value fluctuates based on changes in those two things.
And he also highlights the intensely local nature of value. The example of a ton of coal at the pit mouth near Newcastle. It might cost, say, 2 shillings and sixpence, but that same ton of coal delivered to a home in Grosvenor Square in London could be 25 shillings.
So for the purpose of economic analysis, they're basically two different commodities.
They are. They're subject to different limitations. In this case, the huge cost of transportation. The high price in London isn't because the coal itself is fundamentally more valuable, but because the obstacles limiting its supply in London are much greater.
This grounding in practical reality is fascinating. It leads him to his analysis of speculation, specifically the 1825 bubble. This is where it gets really interesting, because it shows how quickly value can get divorced from physical reality due to mass psychology.
Yes, he relies on an account from a Mr. Tooke. The frenzy began rationally enough. There were these circular letters reporting slightly reduced stocks of important articles like cotton and silk. That led to an initial warranted price rise based on expected future scarcity.
But then expectation completely decoupled from judgment.
It became contagious. The speculation spread to articles that were demonstrably not scarce, or were even in excess. Coffee, despite having adequate stock, shot up 70 or 80%. Spices went up 100 to 200%.
What was the logic?
The logic became self-referential. It was a feedback loop. Everything else has risen, and therefore this will too. The speculators were driven by an overvaluation of the chance of an enormous gain. It's an irrational hope that just overshadowed any rational calculation.
It's an incredible early recognition that economic models based purely on rational self-interest just completely fail to account for the sociology of it all. The panic, the greed, the herd mentality, the things that create bubbles.
It's a lesson for today, isn't it? When we see massive valuations in certain sectors driven less by immediate utility and more by that same circular logic, since others are buying, the price must keep going up. Senior saw that fragility in the market decades before modern behavioral economics.
Okay, so having defined what wealth is, we now have to tackle how it's produced. Nassau W. Sr. agrees that there are 3 productive instruments, but he radically refines the categories.
He keeps labor, and he defines it clearly. The voluntary exertion of bodily or mental faculties for the purpose of production. Simple enough.
Then he changes the old term land to natural agents. Why the change in terminology?
It's that precision again. Land only designates one species, the surface of the earth. But productive agents that don't derive their power from man include climate, gravity, the sun, wind, water power, all of it. If you call the whole genus by one of its species, your definition is already imprecise from the start. Natural agents is just a more accurate, universal term.
And then we get to it. His famous and original contribution, the concept that filled the vacuum where the origin of capital was concerned, abstinence.
Abstinence is his masterpiece of definition. It is the conduct of a person who either abstains from the unproductive use of what he can command, or designedly prefers the production of remote to immediate results. This is the intellectual foundation for saving, for investment, for all future-oriented production.
But wait, doesn't that just sound like saving? Or what Malthus called prudence?
It's much more fundamental than that. Senior argues that capital itself is the result of combining all 3 instruments. You need a natural agent for the raw material, you need labor to prepare it, and you need abstinence to reserve it from being used unproductively right away.
So capital, the physical tool, the warehouse, the raw material, is an article of wealth. But the instrument that created it, the action that allowed that wealth to be set aside for future use, was the sacrifice of immediate consumption. That was abstinence.
And here's the revolutionary payoff. If labor is an action that is rewarded by wages, then abstinence, the conduct of deferring your enjoyment, must also be an action that is rewarded. And its reward is profit.
Wow, okay. That distinction provides a non-controversial, purely logical defense of profit, at a time when profit was often viewed with suspicion, as maybe just the unpaid labor of the worker, which is how later socialist critiques would frame it.
Exactly. Senior makes profit legitimate by associating it with a specific, measurable form of human conduct: delayed gratification. The capitalist profit isn't theft, it's the necessary reward for their conduct, the sacrifice of present use, which is what made all future production possible in the first place.
It gives the capitalists a kind of moral legitimacy they didn't really have before in economic theory.
It does. Before Senior, many economists struggled to distinguish between the wages paid for the labor of the capitalist, for managing the enterprise, and the actual return on the capital itself. By introducing abstinence, Senior cleanly separates the two.
Let's turn to his critique of Adam Smith then, on fixed versus circulating capital. Smith defined fixed capital as things that yield profit without changing masters. So, machines, buildings, and circulating capital as items that are continually exchanged materials, subsistence for workers.
Senior mostly accepts this division, but he takes issue with some of Smith's exclusions. First, Smith excluded the necessaries of life consumed by the laborer and the capitalist for their own support. Senior found this totally illogical.
Right. If a plowman's dinner or the coal that feeds a steam engine is necessary for production to happen, how can you call the consumption of those things unproductive?
You can't. If consumption is necessary for the continuance of the productive effort, it is, by definition, productively consumed. The food and fuel consumed by the working man or the working machine are both productively employed. They are an advance made by the capitalist, and they must be repaid with a surplus.
Senior also criticized Smith for excluding durable items like houses that are built for rental. Smith seemed to put too much emphasis on how quickly something perishes.
And the durability is totally irrelevant. If a jeweler's necklace, which might sit in a shop for 5 years before it's sold, is capital because it's employed for future exchange and profit, then a newly finished rental house has to be capital too. Both are yielding a profit based on the owner's abstinence and their risk of retention. The ultimate test is just whether the item is being employed for the further creation or distribution of wealth.
This methodological cleanup is just immense. By insisting on this precise and consistent terminology, he gave economists a clean structure for analyzing any expenditure or asset. Is it a result of labor? A natural agent? Abstinence? What's its reward? Wages, rent, or profit?
It creates a framework where every penny spent or saved can be categorized. It ensures no necessary element of production is overlooked or mislabeled.
This brings us to a crucial structural difference that Senior highlighted in his fourth elementary proposition. It's about how efficiency changes when we add more labor in different economic sectors.
This proposition is a fundamental statement about the nature of industrial versus agricultural economies. In manufacturing, he says, additional labor employed is more efficient in proportion. You get increasing returns.
This is the magic of industrial specialization in machinery. Senior uses the cotton trade as his example. If 300,000 families can manufacture 240 million pounds of cotton, doubling that workforce to 600,000 families wouldn't just double the output. They could probably manufacture and transport something like 720 million pounds, maybe 3 times the original output.
And why is that? It's because doubling the workers allows for a much greater division of labor, the introduction of more specialized machinery, and efficiency gains that just scale nonlinearly. The only real limit is the availability of raw materials and food for those workers. As long as you can get those inputs cheaply, manufacturing productivity can grow pretty much indefinitely through innovation.
Now, compare that to agriculture, where additional labor employed is less efficient in proportion. You get decreasing proportionate returns.
This is a nod to the Ricardian dilemma. Every increase in raw, produced-in food demands either a disproportionately greater outlay on the land you're already using, more fertilizer, more effort, or it requires you to start using inferior land, which is less fertile and harder to work. You're fighting against diminishing natural returns.
So, improvements in farming machinery might slow down how fast those returns diminish, but they can't fundamentally change the law. To get more food from the same limited land, it will eventually cost more labor per unit of output.
And that structural difference is why industrial nations experience this rapid, often exponential wealth accumulation, whereas societies that are tied strictly to agriculture face these inherent, almost Malthusian limits on their growth and prosperity.
Let's delve into the sources of advantage that we get from capital, the physical manifestation of all that abstinence. The first great advantage is the use of implements.
Tools, machines, they're labor-saving devices, but Senior emphasizes that even the simplest tool, like a carpenter's nail, implies centuries of accumulated abstinence. It is the result of labor that was directed toward a future, distant result. Someone, somewhere, had to abstain from consuming that initial raw material and the subsistence that was needed by the first toolmaker.
That's an elegant way to think about it. The vast inertia of accumulated wealth. Every piece of machinery we use today represents the collective, deferred enjoyment of thousands of our ancestors.
The second major advantage is the division of labor, which, as Senior shows, is utterly dependent on capital. In a rude society, scarcity of capital forces a unity of labor. One person has to do everything from hunting to weaving to building their own shelter. It's only when capital, meaning reserved subsistence, is plentiful that labor can be specialized.
And the gains are astronomical. He uses the utility of government as an illustration of this. In a pre-governance state, every person wastes a massive amount of time and energy on self-defense, on watchfulness, on retribution, and their security is still imperfect.
But by establishing a security force, we specialize that task. A relatively small number of soldiers and police, say 15,000 to protect 17 million people in Senior's example of Great Britain, can manage that security far more effectively than the constant, exhausting labor of 17 million individuals all trying to protect themselves. The efficiency gained from that specialized governmental labor is incalculable.
And this logic extends to what he calls territorial division of labor, or what we'd call foreign trade. Senior notes that nature itself promotes mutual dependence by diversifying products across the globe.
Right. If Britain needs 30 million pounds of tea, trying to produce it domestically would be fantastically expensive, if not impossible. But by specializing in manufacturers like hardware or cotton and trading those for tea, Britain obtains that massive quantity of tea for the annual labor equivalent of only 45,000 men. The efficiency gained from trading based on natural advantage is just immense.
The existence of retailers is another logical consequence of this specialization. They distribute goods in the right quantities and at the right times, which minimizes the purchaser's own labor.
The retailer takes on the labor of sourcing, storage, availability, which frees up the general consumer to focus on their own productive work. It's a lot easier to buy a small amount of sugar from a local grocer than a ton of it directly from a planter in the West Indies. That specialization justifies their profit.
Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like if you enjoy this podcast.
So now that we know how wealth is produced, we have to analyze how it's distributed among the various productive parties. Senior organizes society into 3 distinct classes based on their instrument, their conduct, and their remuneration.
This tripartite division is simple and clean. First, you have the laborers. Their instrument is their mental or bodily faculties. Their conduct is to labor, and their remuneration is wages.
Second, the capitalists. Their instrument is capital, the result of past exertion. Their conduct is abstinence. Their remuneration is profit.
And third, the proprietors of natural agents, the landlords. Their instrument is natural agents, or land. Their conduct, none. As Senior rather provocatively states, they merely hold out their hands, and their remuneration is rent.
And this distinction requires us to focus on the nature of rent. Rent, in Senior's framework, is the revenue that is spontaneously offered by nature or accident. Its existence depends on the land being appropriated and providing a larger return than you could get without its assistance.
But this immediately brings us back to Ricardo. Ricardo argued that rent only arises when cultivation is extended to inferior land, which then necessitates a payment for the use of the better land.
And Senior argues that Ricardo's view is functionally misleading. Rent exists simply because the land is limited and productive. If you had a district that was uniformly fertile but limited in extent, it would afford a high rent immediately because its use provides a surplus over the costs of labor and capital required. The payment is for the use of a monopolized natural agent.
So he argues that extending cultivation onto inferior land isn't the cause of the rise in rents. It's the means by which that rise is counteracted. If society only used the best land, rent would just skyrocket because of extreme scarcity. Extending cultivation dilutes that pressure a bit.
It's a really important semantic shift. Senior highlights the fundamental role of monopoly. the appropriation of the limited natural resource, as the true origin of rent, rather than the differential costs of production that Ricardo focused on.
Moving on, Senior tackles another definitional mess, the difference between the cost of production and profit. He challenges Malthus and others who define the cost of production to include profit.
Yes, and Senior insists that profit is not part of the cost of production. It is the excess of value above the expenditure. If a manufacturer spends £100 on materials, wages, and tools, that's the cost, and sells the final product for 120, that's the value, the £20 profit cannot logically be part of the initial £100 expenditure.
It seems so simple, but why did Malthus and the others confuse this?
Because they lacked the concept of abstinence. They knew the capitalist had to be compensated for their sacrifice and risk, so they just bundled that reward, the profit, into the cost of the accumulated labor. Senior clarifies that the expenditure, the cost, must be repaid with a surplus, the profit. The inducement to continue production requires that surplus. If profit were merely a recovered cost, there would be no reason to invest.
Finally, let's look at monopolies. Senior defines the great monopoly of land as the most significant, but he notes that any exclusive facility, like a patent or any exclusive control over supply, affects price.
Monopolies distort the market. They force the price to diverge from the cost of production. Under free competition, the cost of production acts as a center of oscillation, which it is always endeavoring to approach.
Right.
Price might swing above or below that center due to temporary fluctuations, but competition always ensures it gravitates back toward cost plus an average profit.
Although the real world is messy, fixed capital is sometimes immovable, market information is imperfect.
Exactly. There's friction that keeps prices from settling perfectly at that center. But Senior notes that even in the most complex manufactured good, like a watch, rent, the sign of a monopolized natural agent, is ubiquitous. Rent is paid for the mine that produced the metals, the land the factory is on, the retail shop, the wharf. Though they're small amounts, the existence of these rents demonstrates that every manufactured commodity relies on the concurrence of these monopolized agents.
In defining the categories of consumption, Nassau W. Senior establishes three relative, rather than absolute definitions: necessaries, decencies, and luxuries.
This is a really sophisticated understanding of human motivation. Necessaries are things essential to health, strength, or preserving your existing rank in society. Decencies are things that are required to avoid degradation in society. And luxury is everything else, unnecessary expenditure.
The crucial word there is relative. Senior's example of shoes is perfect. To an English laborer, shoes are a necessary. Going without them leads to sickness and social degradation. But to a low-class laborer in Scotland at the time, where custom permitted going barefoot, shoes were just a luxury. The definition changes entirely based on sociocultural norms.
And that relativity is the key to his analysis of the population question, where he really pushes back against the grim determinism of Malthus. Malthus, you'll remember, argued that population increase must always overwhelm subsistence.
But Senior, while he admits the potential for that pressure, argues that the evil of redundant population is actually likely to diminish as a nation advances in civilization and opulence.
And his mechanism for this is psychological and cultural. As wealth increases, people get used to a higher standard of living. Yesterday's luxuries become today's decencies. And that resulting taste for comfort acts as the preventive check prudence, delayed marriage, that overrides the Malthusian positive checks of misery and vice. People will refuse to marry and reproduce if it means falling below the prevailing standard of decency that they've become accustomed to.
So poverty is self-perpetuating because the very poor lack the means or the cultural aspiration to exercise that kind of prudence. But raising the floor of society provides the strongest possible brake on population growth.
And this brings us to the critique he shared with Archbishop Whately about the ambiguity of one single word: tendency.
It's amazing how one word can change an entire argument. The confusion lies in whether tendency means a cause that would operate if it were unimpeded, like centrifugal force trying to rip the earth apart, or whether it means what is likely to actually take place given all the counteracting forces in reality.
Malthus used tendency in that unimpeded, fatalistic sense. Population can always increase faster than food, therefore it is always a danger. Senior just flips this on its head. He says, look at the historical fact. Compare any civilized country today to its past savage state. Subsistence has demonstrably increased far more than the population has.
So, under the circumstances in which societies are actually placed, the means of subsistence have a greater tendency, in the likely to take place sense, to increase than population does. Civilization is a force for growth, not perpetual starvation.
Right. And Senior identifies the true causes of that improvement: knowledge, security of property, freedom of exchange, and equal admissibility to rank. These institutional factors both boost subsistence and elevate the character of the people, which reinforces that preventive check. So the failure of subsistence to keep up is often a symptom of bad government or restrictive institutions, not some inevitable natural law.
Senior's rigorous definitions provided him with this powerful weapon for dismantling popular economic fallacies. The first major target was the common opinion that the unproductive consumption of landlords and capitalists is beneficial because it furnishes laborers with employment.
This was a deeply entrenched idea. The rich spending extravagantly creates jobs for tailors, servants, artisans. Senior's rebuttal uses his precise terminology to show this is just fundamentally illogical.
Laborers don't desire toil. Employment is just a short way of saying toil, trouble, exposure, and fatigue. What laborers actually require is food, clothing, shelter, fuel the materials of subsistence.
Exactly. If the goal were merely to maximize toil, we should ban all machinery, force farmers to scratch up the land with their fingers, and make weavers use primitive hand looms. The true measure of a laborer's welfare is the facility of obtaining subsistence, not the difficulty.
But the core fallacy is what happens when a landlord stops spending on unproductive luxuries, say gold lace coats. The prevailing thought was that the money just vanishes, and that results in unemployment.
And Senior corrects this. The income doesn't vanish, it must be spent somewhere. If the landlord abstains from that unproductive consumption, he either has to spend the money productively, investing in a factory, improving his estate, or he has to lend it to someone else who will spend it. By whatever path that money takes, the fund for maintaining the rest of the community increases. Productive spending is always superior.
This logical clarity then allows him to tackle the highly political absenteeism debate of his time. This was about Irish landlords who lived in London or Paris. Many people believed these absentee landlords were injuring the national wealth by taking their income out of the country.
And Senior argues that absenteeism is economically immaterial to the nation's total wealth and its wages fund. This was a radical, totally counterintuitive conclusion that required him to carefully trace the mechanism of exchange.
So how does he trace that money flow?
Well, if a landlord lives in Paris, he can't physically take his English rent, which is paid in corn or cattle, with him. That rent has to be converted into exportable manufactures: cotton, hardware, machinery, which are then sold abroad to generate the foreign currency to pay for his consumption in France. French servants, Parisian wine.
So the income still maintains English laborers. It just shifts which laborers. Instead of supporting local tradesmen, gardeners, upholsterers, domestic servants in Leicestershire,
It supports manufacturers, spinners, weavers in Manchester or Leeds. The total national fund for maintaining laborers stays the same. In fact, Senior suggests it might even slightly improve, because the landlord's land that was previously used unproductively, like for a park or feeding his horses, might now be used to produce food or clothing for men.
so if the economic impact is negligible, why was the belief that absenteeism caused damage so strong?
Psychology. The loss is concentrated and palpable. The local village tradesman in Leicestershire knows exactly who stopped buying his goods. But the resulting gain is diffused among millions of manufacturers in a distant city. It's an invisible inference. The doctrine of immateriality is hard to accept because it contradicts visible, local losses. And, as Senior notes, it's humiliating to the educated class whose physical presence is revealed to be economically unnecessary for the country's overall welfare.
This precision also informs his critique of the anti-commercial system, which stemmed from the old mercantile theory that saw national wealth as just accumulated gold and silver.
That mindset led to disastrous policies after the Napoleonic Wars. Countries, trying to protect their domestic industries, erected these massive trade barriers, douaniers, that were often more impassable than seas or mountains. Russia banned foreign manufacturers. England implemented the Corn Laws.
And Senior finds restrictions on foreign raw produce, like the English Corn Laws, to be particularly destructive because they directly target the laboring population.
Right. The consumption of the poor consists principally of raw produce food. The Corn Laws deliberately restrict the supply of that essential raw produce, which increases the cost of subsistence. Their practical effect is to diminish the principal fund for the maintenance of labor. It increases the difficulty for laborers to obtain every single article of their consumption. Restricting imports of manufacturers harms manufacturers. Restricting imports of food harms everyone, but it harms the poorest the most.
Okay, so we've established that wages reward labor and profit rewards abstinence. The final question is one of fairness and efficiency. What causes the vast inequalities in how people are paid? Senior uses his framework to analyze both the objective and the psychological factors here.
He incorporates a lot of Adam Smith's reasons for unequal wages and profits, but he adds some really significant nuance, especially around human psychology. The first cause is non-pecuniary advantages and disadvantages. The idea that mental labor is often inherently delightful. Senior mentions surgeons, statesmen, generals who find real joy in just exercising their faculties. So if a profession provides that intense mental gratification, the purely monetary reward doesn't need to be as high to attract talent.
Exactly. Whereas bodily labor, being almost uniformly disagreeable, requires higher compensation to offset the discomfort. The second factor is the expense and time of education. Professional preparation for a liberal career law, medicine, the church, involves a massive investment of time and money. He estimates it as at least 20–40 pounds for a gentleman's son in his time.
Compared to maybe 40 pounds to raise an ordinary laborer to self-sufficiency. But here's the nuance. Senior argues that the primary motive for this huge educational expense is often the immediate gratification for the parent. The pride in seeing their son's improvement in education, not some cold future calculation of profit. And because that expense is covered by family pride, the necessary future profit required to enter the profession is lower, which increases the supply of highly educated candidates. And then the third cause, and this is the most interesting, is the uncertainty of success, what he calls the lottery effect.
This is where he gets into irrational human behavior. Humans tend to systematically overestimate the chance of an enormous gain and overestimate the fear of an enormous loss.
You see it in lotteries, where people pay far more for a ticket than the statistical value of the expected winnings. And you see the opposite in insurance, where people overpay to insure against a rare catastrophic loss.
And he says professions like the church, the army, and the bar are structurally designed as lotteries. They offer these magnificent prizes, bishoprics, generalships, to a very few, and it only requires a moderate further outlay for those who are already educated. This dazzling, though unlikely prospect drastically increases the competition.
It's a profound institutional insight. Society sells salaries dearly by dangling these magnificent prizes at the top. Thousands of qualified individuals are willing to sell their services at half price for decades because they believe they have a shot at that one magnificent reward. And that drives down the overall average professional wages.
And conversely, employments with a high risk of loss, like mining ventures, have to compensate with an extra profit that's higher than the calculated risk value because of that human tendency to overvalue the contingency of ruin. The fear of failure has to be compensated above and beyond the mathematical average.
Finally, we have to consider the difficulty of transfer, which is all about local value. This explains persistent, geographically based inequalities. In Senior's time, wages in London were nearly double those in the Scottish lowlands because labor moves slowly. People are tied to their homes.
And specialized physical capital, like a massive fixed machine, is also hard to transfer. It might stay employed long after it stops yielding an average profit, just because selling it for crap would be an even greater loss.
But abstract capital money is easily transferable. It can be moved cross borders instantly without any expense via exchange, and this is the crucial difference. Labor is geographically sticky, but capital is fluid.
So the inequality in the rate of profit across the civilized world is much less than the inequality in wages.
Much less. Capital quickly moves to seek the best returns, which tends to equilibrate profit rates globally. It's limited only by a capitalist's unwillingness to change government, habits, or climate. The structural barriers to labor migration are just far, far higher than the barriers to capital movement. And this movement of capital acts as a powerful global equalizer for profit, which wages simply do not enjoy.
This deep dive into Nassau W Senior's outline really reminds us that precise definitions are the foundation of true economic science. His central statements fundamentally reshaped how economists viewed production and value.
The takeaway statements are crystal clear. First, wealth is rooted in utility, scarcity, and transferableness, not exclusively labor. Labor only creates value because the supply of labor is limited, which is a partial cause that others mistook for the universal rule.
Second, capital is the result of labor, natural agents, and that third, necessary behavioral instrument, abstinence. It's abstinence, the deferring of enjoyment for remote results, that legitimizes and earns profit.
Third, manufacturing inherently benefits from increasing returns, while agriculture structurally faces the dilemma of decreasing proportionate returns. That explains the huge divergence of wealth in industrial economies.
And fourth, Policy critiques based on just maximizing employment are faulty. Laborers desire subsistence and comfort, not more toil. The unproductive consumption of the rich doesn't provide a superior national benefit. That income is always spent somewhere, and productive spending is always superior.
And finally, the determination of profits and wages is profoundly influenced by human psychology, specifically that lottery effect, where the potential for enormous, unlikely gains dramatically lowers the necessary average remuneration for skilled professions.
Senior showed that when a landlord resides abroad, the impact is primarily on which laborers are employed. Manufacturers benefit at the expense of local tradesmen. But the total national wages fund remains unaltered. So if the economic effect of a rich person's location is truly immaterial to the national wealth fund, where should we focus our energy? Should we continue criticizing the moral decision of wealthy individuals to leave, or should we instead focus on creating such a robust economy through prioritizing knowledge, security, and freedom of exchange that their mere presence becomes unnecessary for the welfare of the working classes?
That is the ultimate challenge, Senior's rigorous definitions left for the art of government. We look forward to exploring more foundational works with you next time on our deep dive.